Exactly.
So you know what? I guess maybe we'll start with the elections updates, and then we'll move into the other things because we've got some of the questions here. Jesse Martin says, "What's going on with Nevada? I used to live live in Vegas. I don't see Nevada going to Trump due to the Hispanic population. Why are they trying so hard?" So what is going on in Nevada right now? What's the latest?
So the Nevada, of course, passed their laws. For those, just to give you some folks some background, Nevada passed a unique set of election laws that they sort of rushed through the legislature. There's a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor after the 2018 election, and most of the judges, both on the state and federal bench, were put in by Harry Reid's political machine, which was one of the most powerful political machines in the country. Harry Reid also managed to magically get rich while he was in office. One of those unique skill sets that politicians seem to have these days.
Not unique to Harry Reid. It seems to be universal to politicians. They
Oh, absolutely. Harry was just one of the better at it. And so the originally Republicans contested these election laws based on the fact that they allowed for. First, they sent out ballots to pretty much everybody. They said they were only going to send them out to active registered voters. I got multiple ballots at my house here. The other person on there, I've never received any mail for the entire 5 years I've lived here. So I don't know how in the world that person showed up on the, quote, active registered voter list. But and there were many reports of hundreds of thousands of ballots going out to people who are actually not living at the place that they received the ballot.
That was part one. If I stop you there, and just to rehash, I think we mentioned it 2 weeks ago, but the risk there is that people can attempt to send in the ballots and just hope that they get disqualified or refused on the basis of cross comparison to the actual signature cards. But there's a risk that when you have a ballot, you can send it in and hope that that ballot gets counted.
Exactly. And the second component of the Nevada laws was that they can count ballots up to 14 days after Election Day. Now, the Nevada case is heading up to the Supreme Court, apparently, but they didn't get any relief at the lower level. And given statements made by both Roberts and Kavanaugh, it seems unlikely that the Nevada laws will be overturned. This led to the new dispute in Nevada federal courts, which is the great concern was that the only check left on voter fraud, given that anybody could get a ballot. You no longer had the process in place of making sure that only the person who requested a ballot got it. Didn't have any witnessing requirement. So no requirement that somebody witness that you sign it without taking a bribe, without being coerced, without somebody else filling it out for you. So all of those fraud restrictions were already gone. The only one left, and of course, you can send them in whenever, for up to 14 days after Election Day. You could get them in, and the postmark standards are real loose. So supposedly you're supposed to send them in by Election Day, but being able to enforce that is seriously in doubt. There was only one restriction left, and that restriction was, as you note, the checking the signature on the outside of the ballot envelope to make sure it matches the signature of the person in the voter registration file as a deterrent against at least that form of voter fraud. You can't do anything about people who were bribed for their vote, can't do anything about people whose vote was coerced, but you could do something about people who either pretended to be someone else when they sent it in or weren't that person in the first place. And the Republicans monitoring it here in Clark County discovered that they were not really checking the voter signatures meaningfully at all. So that less than 40% were getting checked and that their standards were very loose. And that was always the concern. The concern was that particular check relies on honest, trustworthy election officials, which we don't have in the state of Nevada.
Well, I mean, it's not to be mean or cynical, but nobody is at this point. People are very impassioned, and you have no doubt to anticipate any less passion from the person counting the ballot who thinks if someone is reelected, it might be the end of the world, or someone actually has to get reelected. But these are the people who are checking the signature cards, and they're doing like an amazing amount of volume, I imagine, on a daily basis.
Yes, because all of the other risks in terms of mail people throwing it away, when the Postal Care Workers Union has endorsed Biden, all of those risks, there was nothing they could do about. This was the last one they could check, and they asked to be able to review what was happening, how it was being checked. First, they found out that apparently only 40% were being checked, and then they had questions about whether they were even being effectively checked at all, whether they're being checked by computers or by individuals, what methods were in place. They were getting stonewalled. So they filed suit about that. So that's now the second Nevada suit in place. People like John Ralston, who writes for Nevada Independent, who's a hardcore lefty, he pretends that these suits have no merit whatsoever. And because that the press here, and the so-called independent press is not independent. They're in the Democratic Party's pocket, like John Ralston has always been throughout his career. And so consequently, there hasn't been honest reporting on this suit, unfortunately, out of some aspects of the Nevada press that get followed a lot politically. So that suit's going to go up, and it's going to be whether how the laws get enforced, and that relates. So that's what's happening in Nevada. That corresponds to what's happening in Pennsylvania, where you had two different developments take place. One, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that you could count ballots up till 3 days after Election Day. That was a decision we talked about last week that was up at the Supreme Court. And somewhat to my surprise, frankly, Justice Roberts flipped his vote and let the Supreme Court Pennsylvania vote be upheld, at least temporarily. And there's already a move afoot to encourage Barrett to not get involved in the case because it's back before the Pennsylvania. Because it was a 4-4 decision, there was no decision. They didn't have a majority because Roberts flipped. And by the way, this was complete hypocrisy on Roberts' case, because Roberts, throughout all of these pandemic suits, has been the one issuing decisions saying that that the COVID is no excuse for changing the rule, liberalizing the rules to allow people to get access to the ballot for referendums, for initiatives, for candidates. And it was also the one saying that, and that judges shouldn't be rewriting the rules to do that. And now when judges have done exactly that, he flips his vote, which shows it's a purely politically motivated vote because there's no intellectually consistent explanation for his opinion. And for folks out there that think, are excited about Barrett, I'll just say I was one of the very few people saying this was going to happen with Roberts, and all the people who are praising Barrett right now were all the same people telling you Roberts was going to be a great justice. So let's see.
Roberts says that Roberts was the key vote. I mean, everyone was a key vote to some extent, but Roberts basically says that you can count the ballots up to 6 days after the election.
So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court created that rule all on its own. It was not passed by the state legislature. The prior Supreme Court decision that Roberts had signed on, was a part of, that Kavanaugh wrote a concurring opinion about, said we're not going to let judges change election rules because of COVID. That's a legislative duty. And Roberts himself has written opinions saying that in a bunch of other contexts. And now he turns around and completely reverses himself because it was 4-4. If he votes with the other four justices, it's 5-3. The Pennsylvania ruling is reversed. So this was a judicially engrafted rule that it looked like just 2 weeks ago that Roberts and the majority had come to a conclusion that if it was legislatively created, they would allow it. If it was not, they wouldn't. And now they even reverse on that. So it just shows the absurd hypocrisy up there. It's just a crock.
And with this precedent from the Supreme Court, what does that reflect in terms of what's going to happen in Nevada? Are they going to stretch it to 14 days in Nevada?
So another Pennsylvania case is now going up because Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided to expand the rule, and this relates specifically to Nevada, where is it Nevada? I hate that sound. That sounds terrible. Why do people want their steak to sound like a lamb, like a sheep? Nevada. I mean, it's terrible. I'm sorry. I get all the comments that say I don't know how to pronunciate it. No. I refuse to pronunciate it like I'm an idiot, like I'm a bailing lamb or whatever it is. I just hate that pronunciation. But whatever it is, Nevada or Nevada, I'm going to keep saying Nevada because it sounds better. People should change the name of the state here about pronunciation. But in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court also created a new rule that said you don't have to enforce the signature requirement. So when the ballot comes in, first the ballot can come in 3 days after the election. Second, the ballot doesn't have to be postmarked. In fact, it will be presumed to have been sent before the election, as long as there's no direct contra evidence to say otherwise, which means that if you want to be complicit, you just don't postmark it and send it in, and it works fine for the post office. It gets counted. And third, now you don't have to check the signature on the outside to make sure it's the actual person who's qualified to vote. So that one is it's more egregious, but it's like what they're doing in Nevada. So I think that whatever the Supreme Court decides on that Pennsylvania decision will in turn have a direct impact on the Nevada cases.
Okay,
So
but not to undermine the risk or whatever, to downplay the impact. The two states that have the most active litigation right now, Nevada, Pennsylvania. I think we said Nevada was 6 electoral college votes. Pennsylvania is
20.
20. Okay, so that's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
A few people had asked, Dapper Dave had asked, why is the Supreme Court rendering a decision now when they're missing a judge, when they're 4-4? I presume that even if Amy Coney Barrett gets confirmed, let's just say tomorrow, the day after, she wouldn't partake in these decisions because she wasn't there to be briefed on the case?
No, she still would, because these are all emergency injunction cases. So that's what the Supreme Court continues to take cases, even if they only have 8 justices. So that how many justices they have has no impact whatsoever on their duty, in fact, to take cases. The request was for emergency relief, and they simply declined to give it. Now, that's not a precedential decision, and nobody wrote anything about it, apparently. So it's still an ongoing inside debate. But one of the Barrett fanboys, a guy he goes by Shipwrecked Crew on Twitter, is already writing articles kind of hinting at Kavanaugh flipping, or maybe let's not let, he's hinting that Barrett's not going to be the savior that everybody on the right thinks she is, even though he's argued otherwise throughout the entire time of her nomination process, called me a liar and a bunch of other stuff for questioning Barrett. So it tells you these fakes are gonna, are already previewing what's going to happen. So I hope Barrett, is a 5th vote to change these ridiculous provisions. We got to have consistent standards, at least. It's absurd to say, okay, if you want to get on the ballot as a small third party or initiative or referendum, then all of a sudden courts cannot provide any exception to the law because of COVID. But if you want to stuff the ballot, go ahead, go. You can do that. It shows what a fraud Roberts is. He was always a fraud. So so we'll see what if Barrett's a better vote. I guarantee you that's what Trump was promised in pushing her, was that she would be a 5th vote to overturn bad election rules that were meant to permit or provide a window of opportunity for voter fraud. It's now the counter is like right now in Wisconsin and Michigan, they've got to get the ballots in by election day. The vote signature requirements are still enforceable. There's a strong Republican legislature in both states. The states do not have anywhere near the same. Well, Wisconsin does not have anywhere near the same scale of voter fraud history. Detroit's a different thing. So what's going to happen is some of this will bleed over. You may see if they think what Pennsylvania, Nevada can get away with, you may see it happen in Minneapolis. You may see it happen in Detroit, where they use interesting standards for how they measure mail-in balloting and things like that. They are not legally allowed right now to have ballots come in after Election Day. And they don't have anywhere near the liberalized standards these other states had in terms of sending ballots out. Nevada will still be the worst. Now, the thing is, it's tougher in the Midwest because there's going to be comparisons. So if weird votes come out of Philly, and Trump has been talking about Philly all last 2 weeks, really, talked about in the debates, talked about it again today on Twitter. If they get weird votes out of Philly that don't occur in Cleveland, don't occur in Milwaukee, don't occur in Trenton, then and all the Democrats know this. So the goal is for them to, if you're trying to steal ballots, you want to steal less than 1%. But what is this right now? The U.S. Supreme Court has given them the means to do so, unless they reverse themselves this week.
And so someone had asked previously, how do you fraud out 100,000 ballots? And this is also something we've touched on previously, which was the risk for anybody who believes that there's a risk is that if you can count ballots after Election Day, you know which areas are close, and you know where you can, in theory, if you're going to commit fraud, you know where you need to find ballots and where you need to lose ballots, type thing.
There's three sources of risk: an individual doing it or organizations doing it that don't have any government complicity, sending in bogus ballots, those ballots for people who actually didn't fill out that ballot. The second group is postal workers. Again, you don't need a bunch; you just need 1 or 2 to either throw out ballots from Republican areas or be part of the process of getting a bunch of ballots through that and just not postmarking them so that they'll count automatically now in places like Pennsylvania and partially in Nevada. And then third, someone counting ballots that didn't actually come in, that's in the precinct office or in the election commission. I mean, just 2 years, just recently, a guy confessed in Philadelphia to doing massive ballot stuffing. So the idea that this is unheard of is just a joke. And in fact, you can research Box 13. Great story about how LBJ handled his Democratic primary back in 1948, where they made it he was an expert in making sure that the ballot it's always about knowing how many ballots you need, because you don't want to steal any more than you gotta. I mean, I know that sounds, some people are like, oh, it sounds terrible. I'm just saying that's the approach some people take. Now, you can live in naivete land and pretend that there's nobody in America who would ever do a single fake ballot. Okay, good luck with that. I've been involved in politics 20 plus years, almost 30 years now. Everybody knows this goes on behind the scenes, or just read the book Game Change, first book reference, and read about what Bill Clinton thought Barack Obama did in 2008 in Iowa. Why did he think that? Why did the Democratic president think it would be very easy to steal 50 to 100,000 votes in the Iowa caucuses? Maybe he knew something about how that game works.
So, and now, miscreant, I got that. What would happen if they found that Nevada had a over 100% voter turnout? I mean, that's not, given what voter turnout is, I don't think that's a plausible.
The reason why they don't have to worry about it is you pad the registration rules in the first place. All the registration rules, there are every year, when the census comes out and reports how many people are actually registered to vote, it is often 20 to 40 million less than the number of people who are in the voter file as listed as being registered. So that tells you that there's a huge number of people who are registered, who are dead, who have moved, who have double, triple, quadruple registrations. I mean, sometimes this happens accidentally. Someone may not even intend to do it at all, because there's not an easy mechanism for you to notify the election commission in a city or county or state that you've moved. So if you move out, you're under no affirmative duty, and there's not even an easy process to say, hey, by the way, remove me from that old voter roll. And that's part of the problem.
Amazing. So what are we looking for now in terms of the next developments? There's supposed to be a Supreme Court decision this week, in theory. This is going to be out of Pennsylvania to determine what are the questions again that the Supreme Court decision should determine, and is it on a granting of an injunctive, or is it on a granting of an injunction, or is it going to be a substantive ruling?
Well, it won't be it'll effectively be a substantive ruling, but it's not a petition on the merits. It is instead a request for emergency injunctive relief to stay the decision of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on both whether or not the signature requirement is enforceable, and whether or not the 3-day allowing ballots to come in 3 days afterwards and to be presumptively postmarked correctly, even if they're not postmarked correctly, to reverse those three rules. And so, and I assume Barrett will likely win nomination on Monday, will likely be sworn in by Tuesday, and this will be the first vote up for her. So let's see if she delivers for Trump, or if she is the kind of person I worried that she was. So we'll find out real fast who Barrett really is, at least on this issue. I mean, there's other issues I have worries about. I really thought she'd be a solid vote for Trump on this issue, but I'm getting nervous that these Barrett apologists are already coming up with excuses as to why she won't do it.
What is the excuse? What is the judicial justification? I guess for not intervening on the signature requirement. They're not getting into the substance of the issue. They're just saying that it's a valid decision by the legislature, and we're not getting involved in it. So they're not justifying the preclusion or the lack of the requirement to match signatures. They're basically saying it's the decision of the legislature and we don't get involved. Is that the justification for not getting involved?
It's a twofold. Well, the legislature didn't make any of these decisions. All these decisions were unilaterally imposed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now in Nevada, they have that defense that the legislature passed it, the governor signed it. But in Pennsylvania, none of this was passed. In fact, Pennsylvania legislature is one of the parties suing to stop it. And that's why I thought 2 weeks ago that would be overturned based on what the Supreme Court had just said in the South Carolina case. I mean, what Kavanaugh had said, but Roberts joined at least he didn't write the opinion, but he was one of the yes votes for what happened. And somehow he'd been saying that for the last year when he was screwing over third parties and initiatives and referendums. He was saying, no, we're not going to allow any judicially engrafted exemptions because of COVID. And now all of a sudden, all the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did is they came up with this all on their own. Pennsylvania Supreme Court has been the most activist court in the country. I mean, they went and redistricted the whole state for its congressional districts, opposed to what the legislature did. They've just usurped the legislative role consistently.
But what was the justification for saying we no longer have the requirement to match signatures? Did it have to do with COVID? Did they just say it's too restrictive, not reliable enough, suppressive? Like, what was the rationale?
I'll give a shout out here to Uncivil Law, who did a good view of a case that recently was decided in the Sixth Circuit. Though I'm tempted to say circus, like some of us have said in the past when they've made some interesting decisions. A woman was, as just a brief background of it, a woman was fired because she responded to somebody's post on Facebook because everybody at her work center was so offended by this post that almost none of them ever saw or read. That it wasn't a First Amendment violation to fire her for her speech, according to the Sixth Circuit. He did a good rendition of it. The court's interpretation was ludicrous, but it's a comparable here, because the interpretation basically the Pennsylvania Supreme Court made was their COVID was their excuse for allowing it to come in 3 days later. A North Carolina court did the same thing. I think it's longer than North Carolina, maybe 6 days, maybe even longer than that. That too is going up to the Supreme Court. It's probably less impactful in North Carolina, but it's still a risk of how that works. But in the excuse by the Supreme Court was that even though they passed a law to require a signature requirement, that they interpreted that law to have no self-enforcing mechanism, so no enforcement could be allowed. I mean, I don't understand the decision. I mean, other than being purely politically motivated. I was like, that's the weakest pretext I've ever heard. Everybody knows why that rule is there. The rule is there to make sure that voter fraud doesn't occur. Now, the question for the U.S. Supreme Court is constitutional, because when you have a mechanism of counting ballots that potentially weighs some ballots more than others or allows for voter fraud to occur, that's a 14th Amendment violation. So that's why the U.S. Supreme Court has to always rule on these questions constitutionally. Is this, if it encourages, incentivizes, and provides for voter fraud, what's the pretext for it? And in the past, they've been saying as long as the legislature passed it in response to the pandemic, we'll let it go. Now they've reversed themselves last week, so let's see how it shakes out this week. But the assumption is that they'll make a decision by Wednesday or Thursday, because we're right on the eve of the election. And the Barrett apologists are already saying that an excuse would be, well, it's just so close to the election, don't rule on it. So we'll see. It'll show you never trust these people again if that happens. But I do think Barrett will rule on it, and I do think Barrett will say that the judicially engrafted additions that the Supreme Court is imposing in Pennsylvania are invalid, and that in turn will likely lead to enforcing the law differently in North Carolina and Nevada, which will in turn deter efforts that might go askew in places like Detroit, Michigan, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Okay, so we may, if we don't do a midstream next week, we'll certainly be revisiting this next Sunday.
Yep, no doubt about it. It's getting crazy.
I'm just trying to do the math in terms of these states that are going to be the most affected by this, and then see how the Electoral College plays out the night of, and these may become academic legal questions as opposed to the swing vote or the hanging Chad type questions.
And I think that they won't try to send in a bunch of bogus ballots if Trump wins anyway, because say he wins Florida, it's very hard to do voter fraud in Florida now, because the Palm Beach and Broward counties, where there's a history of it, Republican appointed independent commissioners have been appointed to run those counties. So there's there's still a risk, because the threefold risk, just to remind folks, is one is a risk totally outside of government actors, just organized people doing this. There's Republicans got busted in North Carolina for doing this, and I think in a special election, a consultant did. So you have that risk. The second risk is the mail, what they do with the mail. That's what Trump is actually mostly concerned with. That's why he's been telling people vote early in person or vote election day in person, but don't vote by mail. And then third is what the election officials themselves do. So some of that risk occurs, and so you could have litigation in Michigan, you could have litigation in Wisconsin. The Pennsylvania Attorney General is Democratic, is assigning a bunch of people to fight efforts on election day, so he's anticipating it. And of course, Joe Biden, in one of his moments of sanity or whatever you want to call it, said that he has built the greatest voter fraud organization in history. That was
Someone mentioned that.
actually his exact words.
So
So
some
I
would
don't
say,
think he obviously meant it that way, but, I think it was a Freudian slip.
okay, we'll end with this one here. Dapper Dave says, based on your previous arguments, doesn't the Pennsylvania state legislature and Senate run by Republicans just have emergency session and change a law?
The Democratic governor won't sign it.
And the refusal to sign based on what?
He just won't. He'll veto it on the grounds that we have to worry about the pandemic. That's the most important thing. We want to stop Republican efforts to suppress the vote. It'll be that kind of language. But that's the issue in all these states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. No matter what the legislature governor split is, one party has Democrats control the governorship in all four. That's why you're not seeing this problem in Ohio or Iowa or Florida or Arizona, where you have Republican governors.